Good evening. Welcome to the second webinar in the Succession Planning for Woodland Owners series. I'm Liz Jackson. I'm a Forestry Extension Specialist with Purdue University and Executive Director of the Indiana Forestry and Woodland Owners Association. We're glad you're able to join us for this important topic that will have an impact on all of us. A few housekeeping notes. The presentation is going to be recorded and it will be sent to registrants after the meeting. It may take me a week or two to get those edited and put together. And we will also share some further reading tomorrow and in an email, and we will also send those when we send the recordings. If you will keep your microphone muted during the presentation, we will take questions in the chat and answer those at the end, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you at the end. And please don't share personal information. We would like to protect your private information. So if you could ask general questions, of course, they can be about your situation. Just try to generalize those so we don't reveal anything that's private. And a few caveats for you. These are intended to present general information on succession planning. It may not be applicable to every state or territory. We are located in Indiana, although we've advertised this broadly, so the information may not apply if you're out of Indiana. And it does not provide legal advice. If you need specific advice, which you likely would, we would ask you to obtain that from an attorney or another professional that's well versed in the laws and rules of your situation. So we are giving this to you generally and hope that you can use it in that regard. I'd like to thank the Purdue Succession Planning team who volunteered their time to put this program together for us. Tonight we have two of the team members with us. Renee Wyatt is a family business management specialist in Purdue Agricultural Economics Department, and Maria Marshall is a professor of ag economics at Purdue. We appreciate them joining us to share their expertise. And now I'll pass it on to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. So tonight we're going to be talking about navigating succession struggles and talking about conflict in that succession process. I'm sure you can all think of some examples for yourself. But we're going to kick tonight off just by talking about why are we fighting? So we know there's conflict. Anytime we have family and money, property, assets combined, we're going to have some fighting. But just first, we're going to talk about, why is there so much conflict when we talk about succession? So the first thing is family legacy. I think when we're talking about whether it's farmland, forest land, family property, family assets, there's a lot of legacy tied in there. A lot of different family members have a lot of different memories with the property, with the assets. They have a lot of different ties. So whether or not they inherit something or they get to purchase something, there's that legacy that's so important in a lot of different ways to different family members. Large amounts of assets. As we've all known, if you've been following land values, they've been going up, 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 and up. Land is getting more and more costly, more and more expensive. So there's more assets there. Even if it hasn't grown in size, it's grown in value. So that can cause a lot of conflict. If you do have an operation, mixing that business with family can cause issues. Sometimes, we get along in both the business and the family. Sometimes we can just get along in the family. It just depends on how our family behaves, right? So there's a lot of conflict that can occur when we mix business and family together. Communication across generations. So this can be a huge issue in succession. A lot of times we have multiple generations trying to compare goals, trying to think about a best strategy for succession. Who's going to get what? How do we talk about that? So communication across generations is definitely an issue. Different generations have different values. They might communicate in different ways that can be hard to understand. And so hopefully today's program will tell you a little bit more about those different ways that we can talk to each other and different conflict modes that we have. And you can recognize those both in yourself and in others. Different values. Different family members have different values. They might have come from the same, small family, right? 4 kids have the same parents. They could have all different values. So that can cause conflict. these different conflict styles. So we're going to talk about conflict modes today, and that can help you kind of navigate that situation when it comes to succession. Misaligned goals. This goes back a little bit to values, but some people have different goals for the property or for the operation, for the forest, whatever that may be, and that can cause conflict. Lack of communication, a little bit different than just, problems in communication, but not talking at all can also cause problems. When we don't know what's coming, it can cause issues. And ultimately, emotions can run high when we're talking about this legacy, all of these emotions that we have in a farm or a forest. It can make your emotions run really high. Lastly, there's not always a fair or equal way to distribute the forest or property to the next generation, and that can cause conflict as well. Ideally, we could parcel it out into everybody. If you have 20 acres and you have 4 heirs, everybody gets 5 acres, right? That are perfectly symmetrical and they're all equal value. In reality, that doesn't really happen. So that can cause issues in succession as well. So when we do have conflict or the threat of conflict, it can often lead to a lot of these symptoms, such as uncertainty and ambiguity. A lot of people don't know the timeline for succession, who will control what everyone will receive. It's a hard thing to bring up, especially if you're in that successor generation. It's hard to say, hey, when are things going to transfer? Who's going to control what will everyone receive? It can come off a little bit as being selfish sometimes, even though really that successor just wants to know, right? It can affect their life. They want to know what's coming. The successor can feel punished if they stay in the operation. If it is a business operation, they can feel punished for staying in the operation or in the management and not advancing and not having control over ownership and management. There's a potential for damaged relationships if we have too much conflict in the succession process. And ultimately, a lot of times we have conflict because there's decision paralysis, right? There's too many options, or we don't know what our options are. We don't want to make the wrong move. And so we just have this decision paralysis where no decisions are made. And that causes issues and conflict in families. So we did this survey in 2023 of farms in the North Central region. And we said, okay, you inherited the business from a family member. So if they did, they answered this question for us. We asked, how successful did you perceive that transfer? Right. So they're the ones who inherited the farm. Thankfully, 78% said successful, but we still had 20% that said unsuccessful. And so we asked each of those responses, why? Why was it successful or why was it unsuccessful? And it was funny, they really kind of mirrored each other, because the ones who said it was unsuccessful, they said the process was not what I expected. So that ambiguity piece, right? They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know how the process was going to go. And on the other side of that, those who said it was successful, they felt certain and secure in the timeline and who was to be included. So as humans, we like to know what's coming next. We like to have that certainty. So this data here just speaks to that, and it really applies to succession.
So the succession process really requires the commitment from the incumbent and the successor, or whoever's going to be part of the process, to be committed to the process. It requires both parts, like I said, the incumbent and the successor. There we go. And it part of the succession process, or part of being in kind of thinking about business and family, is as the next generation is coming in, is thinking about this adaptation of roles. So it's hard sometimes to think as parents that our children at some point will be our colleagues, right? It's hard to think of them as colleagues. I have a 10-year-old. I can't think of him. I'm telling him to brush his teeth. I can't think that he's going to be my partner one day, but eventually they will. And so it's an adaptation for myself, that now my child, or my niece or my nephew is going to be my partner, and in business, and for the child themselves to also think of themselves as an adult equal partner in that process and in that business. So there is this changing of roles that has to be like, I have to think of somebody differently, but I have to behave differently as I'm thinking about this changing of roles. And so as the incumbent, that's the older generation or the senior generation, that's the one that initiates the transition process, but both have to be willing to meet in the middle. And sometimes we think, well, the successor needs to do this and this and this for me to feel comfortable. Well, but that's actually an adaptation of both roles of both individuals. So it's really about an alignment of goals. So Renee talked about all the different reasons why we can have a conflict. Well, not having aligned goals would be part of that conflict, right? And having goals means that we have our values, we set our goals, and thinking about, well, whose goals, preferences actually do we need to think about? Do we need to think about the goal preferences of the successor generation, but also make sure that the incumbent still gets what they need as well, right? So as we try to get to this win-win situation, it becomes where you can see this increased you need to have increased family cohesion as you have more communication. So it's really thinking about, they're both mutually dependent, the incumbent and the successor, the generations are mutually dependent, right? Parent and child. Eventually we're codependent in a good way. That's what we want to do. So both parties need to acknowledge each other's goals and concerns. And that's where some conflict can come. And conflict, I guess I'll take a step back and say conflict is not bad, right? That just means that there's friction and there are things that need to be talked about. And then when you don't talk about, that can be, it make it worse. Sometimes we think, well, if you don't talk about it, it'll go away. In this instance, it won't go away, as Renee had said. So as we think of how critical it is to make these goals, think about the considerations and think about the fears that might come up for each generation. So for the successor, it might be uncertainty, the risk of putting something in and not getting anything out. And for the incumbent, it could be, well, I'm not sure that their goals are aligned with what I want to happen with this land. I want to make sure it stays in forest lands. I want to make sure it stays in the family. And I'm concerned that maybe they don't have the same values and think about. So there's fear there about this kind of risk of not things not happening as you want them to happen. So as we just talk about those things, then we can make them more visible to both the incumbent and the successor and have the satisfaction for both parties. And so we're going to talk now about conflict modes and how to use them. So again, thinking about conflict and these conflict modes, conflict in and of itself is, we tend to think of conflict as always a bad thing, but conflict can happen. Oh, sorry, way too far, way too fast. Conflict can happen just as sorry, keep moving this. So conflict can happen even if you say, okay, when are we going to go to dinner? And you disagree on the time. That in itself is conflict, right? But that's no big deal. We could say, well, I want to go at 6, you want to go at 7, let's just go at 6:30. And we just compromised. That's a conflict mode. We just resolved a conflict, right? So it can be very little, but then succession, right? There's a lot more emotion involved in there. There's a lot more at stake. And so it can tend to think, we tend to think about it as a big thing, but you are going to have conflict. It's anytime you're trying to get to something, there's going to be conflict, but you need to want to push through it and through the conflict. And these conflict modes help you think about, how am I dealing with these situations? So we want to make sure that for conflict, to resolve a conflict, we talk about getting to a resolution. Well, resolution is an outcome. It's not a process. Sometimes we call, well, the process of resolution. Well, the resolution itself is an outcome. You might have a lot of process to get to a resolution, and you might never get to a resolution. Sometimes there's a conflict that you just walk away from and you don't get to a resolution. Or I guess you could say walking away from it is a resolution itself. But we tend to think of resolution as with both parties come back together cohesively and productively to move forward into whatever they're doing. That's what we would call a resolution of the conflict. Walking away and leaving things as they is not necessarily a resolution. You want to make sure that the parties return to productivity. And for here, a family business, you want to make sure that the land is still in control of the family. Maybe that's a big goal, that you have family cohesions. We always talk about succession as having family control, competent owners, and family cohesion. That for us is a successful succession. So if you think of those things, having those at the end would be getting to resolution around the succession process. So conflict modes have kind of two scales. You have assertiveness and you have cooperativeness. And you'll see that at the most assertive, you might have competitors, and at the most cooperative, you have um, accommodators. But it's really about your conflict mode. It's about what is your skill, what are you most comfortable with a lot of times, and the situation that you're in. So that's what's going to give you a conflict mode. And as we go through this, keep in mind that we want to be able to use all the conflict modes, right? It's like we want to use all of our muscles, right? We don't want to just use one arm and exercise one arm, right? We want to make sure that we use all the conflict modes, but there's the situation that you're going to use them with. And so we all default to one. It's kind of the way our personalities are that we tend to default to one, but sometimes our default conflict mode is not the best for that particular situation. So understanding the different conflict modes and the uses of them will help you think about, well, this is a situation where actually this might be a better conflict mode than the one that I usually default to. So if you're an avoider and run away, right, that might not be the best situation for succession in particular, but that's not the best situation all the time. So there's 5 conflict modes. Like I said before, we have from very assertive, the competing conflict mode, to very cooperative, the accommodating mode. So the I would say the best mode, or not the best. There is no best where we want to use them all. But sometimes the most difficult mode is collaborating, because that's where you have assertiveness and cooperativeness, right? So everybody's getting really their needs met when you're collaborating. But if you've ever tried to collaborate, right, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of communication, right? So that's not, even though it's like where everybody gets to a win-win, it might take just too long, right, to get to collaborating. Then you've got compromising, where you've kind of in the middle of assertiveness and cooperativeness. And then you've got avoiding, which is not assertive and kind of not cooperative, but you're just kind of avoiding. And then accommodating, where you've got low assertiveness and very cooperativeness. But we're going to go through each of these individually and talk about their uses.
Okay, so the first mode that we're going to talk about today is that competing mode. So that's very high on assertiveness. It's not very cooperative, as you can imagine. Sometimes we think of, a bulldog, a big rough bulldog in this situation. But something that you might think about when you think about competing is might makes right. But we're going to talk about, when we can use this competing style. So in general, when we're talking about day-to-day life, whether it's with your family, whether it's, just day-to-day life, you can use the competing style if you have to make a quick, decisive decision. So if there's an emergency, somebody needs to say, this is what we need to do, you do this, we're going to get through this together. That's competing, even though we don't really think about, maybe a first responder or, somebody responding to an emergency being a competitor, but it's a good way to use that mode. Another time you might use competing is when an unpopular course of action needs to be taken. Maybe you need to cut costs. Maybe your forest had some kind of lawsuit against it and you have to go away you don't want to, right? We hope that doesn't happen. But if you're in a business, if you're an owner, you might have to enforce certain rules. You might have to discipline employees. It's uncomfortable, but using that competing style would be a good way to use that. There could also be, issues that are vital to the company's welfare if you have a company and you know that you're right. So you have to compete to make sure that others listen to you and that, what you're saying is actually taken into account and being done. Sometimes you have to compete to protect yourself from people who want to take advantage of your non-competitive behavior. So if you're an avoider or if you're an accommodator, if that's your default mode, a lot of times people will know that and kind of try to get their way, and they just assume that you're not going to compete. This would be a good time for you to implement that competing style and stand up for what you believe in, protect yourself, and get your voice out there. When we think about this in terms of succession, you can use it when you're standing up for non-negotiables, and that would be for each generation, right? Every generation in the succession process will have some, non-negotiables. So say somebody says, you know what, I'm going to take all of this forest and I think we should turn it into cropland. If that's a non-negotiable for you, that's a good time to use your competing style and say, no, absolutely not. State why, make sure you're heard. Just overall to make sure your voice is heard in that planning process, you can use the competing style. If you overuse it, however, you will notice you have yes people around you. If you've heard, people say yes to you all the time, that's a good indicator that maybe you compete too much. Maybe you need to use some less assertive conflict styles in other realms. It's a good balance to have all 5 in your back pocket where you can use them when you need to. The next mode we're going to talk about is very assertive, very cooperative. This is the mode that takes the most time. So collaborating. We could say 2 heads are better than 1, right? We want to take into account everybody's perspectives, come to make sure everybody's needs are met, like Maria said before. This is one where everybody walks away pleased because, they got to a solution where everything is put to resolution and everybody's heard. So in general, you can use this collaborating style when you need to find an integrative solution. Make sure that all of the concerns of all parties involved, are heard. And you can use this when the concerns of each party are really too important to be compromised. So if it's a really important decision, where are we going to go from here? What are our integrated goals? What do we do about this issue? Right? If there's a big issue, you probably want to use that collaborating style. Collaborating helps you to merge different insights from different perspectives. It can also help if you need to work through hard feelings and it's a relationship that matters to you. You're going to want to take the time to collaborate. Now on small day-to-day things, like, I'll use Maria's example. When we're going to go to dinner, we probably don't need to collaborate, right? We don't need to brainstorm and take everybody's perspective and think about the pros and cons, right? We just need to make a compromising decision. But on decisions that really matter and can have long-term effects, we want to use this collaborating style. So you may have guessed this. In succession, we're going to use collaboration a lot. We really want to get an integrated solution that works for all parties. In succession, the concerns of both parties or all parties are way too important to be compromised or avoided. We want to make sure that we maintain the family relationships and the operation of the property, right? We want to have a successful family, and we also want to have a successful business or property, whatever that looks like for you. We want to make sure that both move into the next generation communicating, able to spend time together, work through problems together, and be cohesive in their own units and together. And then next, we're going to talk about compromising. So this is right in the middle of that assertiveness and cooperativeness. So it's splitting the difference. Really, we're going to come to an agreement somewhere in the middle. So compromising can be used when goals and concerns of parties are moderately important. So they do matter, but it's not really worth the disruption that we take when we're using collaboration, because that mode is going to, take a lot more time. If you have 2 opponents who have equal power and are strongly committed to different goals, we probably want to compromise, come to somewhere in the middle. You can use compromising as a temporary settlement of a complex issue. You say, we need to make a decision for this. Let's come somewhere in the middle. We can go back to it later and collaborate when we have more time. That's a way that you can use compromising just temporarily. If you need to arrive at a fast solution under time pressure, and then maybe, your competing mode isn't working, you're not getting what you want. And so you back up a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to be a little bit less assertive, a little bit more cooperative. And so let me do that. We'll come to compromising instead of collaboration or competition. When you think about compromising in succession, I really caution you to use it sparsely. You don't want to be using compromising all the time, or else you're going to get somewhere down the road where your needs weren't met, your concerns weren't heard, and the outcome really isn't what you expected or what you wanted. So the issues are way too important to both parties or all parties. Really, if we have too much compromising, the people who are doing the compromising are going to have resentment down the road, and that's not what we want for either generation, for any generations.
So the next one is avoiding. So this one is low on assertiveness, low on cooperativeness. And so it's this leave well enough alone type of concept um, that we sometimes see. And I have to say that I surveyed some students that were going to be in succession, and a lot of them came up of avoiding. They're like, "Oh, I've just learned not to talk about it," right? And that's not what we want to do. Sorry, the thing is going on its own. So when do we use the avoiding style? Well, when an issue isn't as important to us, right? When we think it's just not that important, so we can go ahead and just avoid and be like, oh, that we could just leave that alone. Well, when you perceive that there's no chance of satisfying your concern. So a lot of times, if there's a competitor, for example, and they really just want to get their way, and you're like, I'm just, I know I'm just not going to get my way. I'm just going to avoid it. So a lot of times, as Renee said, if you have a competing boss and that's their preferred style all the time, you will have a lot of avoiders in the office as well. Or if you have a very autocratic parent, you tend to have an avoiding child, right? So those two kind of come hand in hand sometimes. So when the potential costs of confronting a conflict outweigh the benefits of its resolution. So when you think this it's going to cost you more than you're going to get, and in the end, you might avoid that conflict. So we might use this in the office, right? If it's not, you're not, it's just the cost of that fight, let's say, or that conflict is just going to be more than the benefits or the rewards in the end. When you need to let people cool down. So this is a good time when if you think you're collaborating, you're trying to get your needs met, everybody's trying to get heard, and things are starting to get a little bit heated. You might say, okay, we all need to calm down, take a step back. We can come back to it next week, or we can come back to it tomorrow. So to let things kind of settle, and sometimes need to let people process that. So that's an avoidance. So sometimes we don't tend to think of this as an avoiding conflict, but if you ask somebody to do something, or I've learned that as a boss, if somebody asks me something, I might need to say, let me get back to you on that and give you a response. That's actually avoiding, right? It's not, it's like I need to get back to it and kind of process that request before I do something. Because I'm like the next one, I want to gather more information and then weigh the advantages instead of making an immediate decision. So sometimes making that immediate decision isn't the best thing. So avoiding for a while is okay. When others can resolve the issue more efficiently. So a lot of times you need to let's say your kids figure it out themselves, and you don't get into the conflict. You avoid it, right? So you're letting others resolve this issue on their own. And when an issue seems symptomatic of another more basic issue. So a lot of times there's a conflict, but that conflict is not about where does the coffee pot need to be. It's a symptom of other things that have come up before. And so you want to avoid where does the coffee pot need to be and try to get to what the actual conflict is, right? So how and when do we use the avoiding style in succession? Well, you want to you really it's like compromising. You want to be careful about using avoiding too much. I think the cause of a lot of times of family successions not being successful, it's because there's a lot of avoiding. And there's a lot of, we asked the question, how often do you talk about succession? And or is there conflict around succession? And people say, no, not at all. And then we say, well, how often do you talk about it? Only when we need to, right? That's an avoiding style. And so you don't want to avoid it. We also hear stories of people say, well, I don't want to think about it. My kids will take care about it when I pass away, right? That's the ultimate of avoiding the conflict of succession and where you want to happen. So if you avoid when issues are important to both parties, there's again, like compromising, a lot of resentment will come up afterwards. And maybe people are okay, I won't be here, so I'm not going to worry about it. But remember the three C's of successful succession: control, competent owners, and family cohesion. And so avoiding really does not get you to family cohesion. It might keep control and you might still have competent owners, but you want to still have family cohesion. And that's where that's important to not to avoid this, even if it's going to be a hard conversation. You don't want to use this too much in terms of the avoiding style. The next one is accommodating. So that's low on assertiveness, but high on on cooperativeness. And so accommodate is, it will be my pleasure, right? I can say that I'm an accommodator at home. That is my default style is to accommodate, right? And so that is, it's like to say, oh, well, yeah, I want you to be happy. So I would do what you would prefer. So, when does this style is used? Well, when you realize that you're wrong. So it's all the times you're like, well, yes, I made a mistake. You're right. You're right. So we might use an accommodating style. When the issue is more important to the other person than it is to you. And so it might be, well, what color do the curtains need to be? And somebody's like, it's really, I don't care. It's as long as maybe you say, well, as long as it's not black, I'm all right with whatever color curtains that is, right? So there's a lot of decisions that we make as family, as coworkers, where that decision is not as important to us. That issue isn't as important to us as it is to somebody else, and we're happy to accommodate whatever this decision they come to. When you want to build up social credit for later, so that you can get your way later on another issue, right? So building goodwill is what we would say. So you say, okay, well, that I'm happy to give on this because I want to build the goodwill to be able to get my way on something else, right? So that's when we would use an accommodating style. When you're outmatched and losing, and more competition is only going to damage your cause more, you might accommodate, and say, well, okay, I'm okay giving up on this because it's going to be more damage to the relationship or more damage to the business. A lot of times you feel like it's more damage to the relationship, and so you're willing to accommodate. When you want to preserve harmony and avoid disruption, that's going to be important to be an accommodate. Again, a lot of accommodating style is around keeping harmony, around those around you. That's the most important part usually to an accommodator, is to keep family cohesion and keep that harmony going. A lot of times also you want to use accommodating styles when you want to let somebody make their own mistakes. And so you let them go on and do it their way, even though you might think, well, there's better ways to do this, right? We use it with our kids all the time, right? They need to make their own mistakes and they need to learn. And so they might say, no, I think it's this. And you're like, okay, right? And you let them go on and learn from their own mistakes. Um, so in succession, there are things that you might not think that they're not as important to you, that you are willing to accommodate as a gesture of goodwill to move the process forward. We might accommodate. Again, you don't want to use it too much because it can build resentment again, because it's not about meeting your needs as well, right? Remember, collaboration was about meeting the needs of both parties, and that's why it's an important process, it for succession. So accommodating is you're giving up and you're actually willing to give a lot more, and sometimes that can build resentment. If you accommodate too much, you can see my examples. If you do it too much, you're starting to build resentment because you're always saying, well, okay, okay. And what tends to happen a lot of times, if accommodation is your default style, is that you've accommodated so much, and then somebody says they want to go to a steakhouse one time too many, and you explode and say, I've had steak every single time, right? It's that tends to go a little bit hand in hand when you accommodate a little too much. And so you want to be careful about using accommodation all the time, and particularly in this process, because as Renee showed, that 20% that said, yeah, the farm, they got the farm, but they're just not happy about it. There's a lot of accommodation that might have gone on there. So again, when using the conflict modes, remember you want to use all five. You want to learn to be able to use all five, because again, it's about that situation. That's the right for the different skills. So it's each has its place, and it really depends again on the situation. And it's like exercising all of your body. You want to make sure that you're really thinking about what's the best mode to use. And I know that in the process, things are heated, and so that's where our default mode comes in. because when we don't think about it, we go to our default mode. But if we have the time to think about the conflict and think about what we want to get done, then we can think about, oh, what's the best mode that I should be different? And you can have different modes in business and in family, right? So somebody can be a big competitor in the workplace because maybe that's what their job demands of them, and a compromiser at home. That might be their default mode. So a lot of times when we do the TKI default modes, we actually think about this in your family and then think about this at work, because you do tend to sometimes have different modes. So you'll get a handout with this, with the video. I think Liz said tomorrow you'll get a handout. But if you think you know what your default conflict mode, go ahead and put it in the chat. And we'll see. I already told you that I tend to be an accommodator, particularly at home, right? Because I'm about more harmony. But if you want to go ahead and put your what you think is your default mode in the chat, we'll start to look at this and see how many of each we might have as we go along. Right. I see accommodators, compromisers, compromising, competing, and collaborator, building consensus. Great. Well, I will say, remember, there's no right or wrong. So it's all about, knowing what you default to. And then as changing, oh, and I think somebody said, yeah, as they get older, they're more collaborating. That is that your conflict modes, as you get more comfortable with all the modes, they can change. And yes, we might have been a big competitor when we're younger and become more of a collaborator or a compromiser as we get older, right? And maybe older and wiser, we start to use more modes. Life experience may change the default modes that we use or how comfortable we are with using all the different modes. But it can be hard if you are a collaborator and avoider to suddenly decide to I need to be able to use a competing mode, right? It's about practice. And a lot of times it's about thinking about, well, I do need to get my voice heard, and getting past that oomph of like, yeah, I need to use that competing mode a little bit more now because my needs need to be met. But it can be hard, but it is a matter of practice.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you about a conflict scenario that we can think through. I know this is a family operation, so this is a business, but I think we can all think about, how we would handle this if we were in the scenario. So Trish had joined the family hog operation with hopes of one day owning and managing the business. She has no other siblings interested in joining the business, and she seems like the obvious successor. After 15 years of being an employee and no plans or discussing of Trish taking over the business, she applies for an outside job. Her parents are devastated. They always assumed that Trish would be the one to take over the business when they decided to retire. So this is a real scenario we've worked through with a family. But what could have been done to avoid this issue altogether? If you want to put it in the chat, I would love to hear from you. So what do we think could have helped that situation? Frank was the first one to respond, and he says communication. Yeah, open talk of goals. Trish needs to tell her parents that she was restless. That's exactly right. Clear communication up front on people's expectations. Very good. You guys, either you had the knowledge already or you've learned from the presentation. Hopefully both. But that's exactly right. Communication is really, really, really vital to succession and just having a family work together in general. Sometimes you don't have to avoid a conflict, it can be mitigated altogether, right? This leads back to that successor feeling resentment for not taking ownership and management over an operation. I mean, we've had all kinds of families reach out to us and say, we need a meeting on campus. We have an issue we can't work through. There's one that we kind of laugh about. You know, it was two brothers who didn't really get along. One of the brothers, his kids wanted to farm, and he came in and said, I'm ready to step away from the business. My kids are obviously going to farm my ground, but I don't know about my brother's ground. And his brother was in the room, and he said, well, yeah, your kids are going to farm my ground. And we laughed and we said, well, we're glad we could help you communicate through that. But really, it shows at the very basic level, how important communication is. These brothers had these thoughts about each other, right? These ill will and, not great thoughts about each other. And it could have all been avoided if they would have just had a simple conversation. Sometimes it's hard with family, right? But communication is really vital, and it can help us to be at resolution if we do have a conflict and work through those issues.
So we really want to get get to this resolution in succession, and it can take a long time. It's The succession process can take for intra-family succession about 6 years, 6 to 10 years, right? A lot of times we say, well, how long is it? Because we're bringing people in, we're thinking about how we're going to do this. It might be part of the estate plan, so it might be for a longer time, but we still have this process to go through, professional development or things we need to tell the incumbent that's coming in. So it is kind of this resolution in succession that may take a while to happen. So getting to a resolution, oh, I don't know what happened.
I don't either. I'll get it back up here.
Well, getting to a resolution is not always going to happen, right? And might not always happen in a way that we want it to happen. So a lot of times we want to talk about when we are thinking about a conflict and we're all thinking about getting to a resolution and explaining ourselves or starting to say about something that's bothering us, we want to kind of use these I feel statements, which is, when you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. Right. So it's not accusatory of like, why don't you answer the phone when I call you? Right. It's more like, well, when you don't return my calls after I leave a message about our contract or about whatever it was, I feel like my concerns are not important. Right. It's these I feel statements, which doesn't put somebody at the defensive. So a lot of times, and we're all parts of family, and there's nobody that can push our buttons better than your siblings or your parents or your kids. There's something about we're just more vulnerable with family and what when they say things to us, right? And so making and thinking about this that thinking about things that are really important, making people not be on the defensive is important. So these I statements can really help you say when you do this in this situation, it really bothers me, it makes me feel this way, right? So you're talking about how you're feeling about something, and that can really start to disarm somebody because you're vulnerable at how you feel, and you can start to think about the resolution and having an attitude of resolution, because it is having an attitude of resolution means you do want to take a step back, think about how others are feeling in the situation, and trying to get to what is better and fair for everyone, right? So it is about having this attitude of resolution, of wanting to get there. Remember that resolution was where we're getting back together and being productive and moving forward. So it really takes that attitude of resolution to get there. It doesn't just happen magically, right? It takes effort. And it takes using your conflict modes and these I statements and thinking about what's fair and thinking about how others are feeling and validating people in their feelings to get to this place, right? So that's why we're always talking about succession can be hard, because it really takes time, and it really you're trying to get to a place that takes time and takes a lot of collaborating right? And so meeting people's needs. Renee, I can't move the thingy forward, so if you can move the slide forward, thank you. So again, getting to resolution, requires a lot of communication, right? Sometimes I think it requires over communication, not just a lot, just an over communicating of how things are going, because it takes time, right? And we don't want to build resentment of things that, like Trish, things not happening, right? Things not moving along. The realization that, again, succession takes time. You might need outside help, is needed. So a lot of times, Renee are come in as just kind of facilitators to set the table, to make sure that everybody is being heard. Not necessarily because people are, fighting or they're disagreeable, but just kind of setting ground rules and thinking about, okay, let's get to from point A to point B, and helping facilitate a meeting. Right. But you might need the help of a CPA, you might need the help of a lawyer, so thinking about that outside team that can help the family move things along. And of course, commitment to the process is necessary. We talked about you need to adapt roles, you need to think about conflict modes, you need to think about communication, right? That's a commitment of process to get to those three C's, right? Control, competence, and cohesion. Can move me forward. Great. So again, the ultimate goal is really succession, right? It's, focus on the message and the underlying feelings of the speaker and yourself, with the ultimate goal that we want this to be a family thing. We want this to uh, we want everybody to feel good about this process and that we're moving along. And sometimes that process means that your things will not be divided equally amongst, your three kids. Sometimes the process is that, yes, that's going to happen, and sometimes it's not. And so what we've learned is that when you communicate to your successors that this is the process and this is why I'm doing things the way I'm doing, people are more often than not say, "Oh, okay, I get it. I might not completely agree with your decision, but I understand your decision." And that's what's really important in this process, is providing, remember that overcommunication, explanation of why you're getting to the point you are, even if the successor may not agree with all the decisions that you've made. Next. Great. And we are at the end of our presentation. We're happy to take questions and comments. But I think I guess I'll end with what we've learned is that it's not the finances, it's not the legal structure that makes the succession process not go forward. It's usually communication and lack of family cohesion that actually get in the way of moving a process forward. It's a lot of people want to talk about what LLC should I be, and that does not solve the problem. So it's really about, because sometimes you need to kind of think about what the goals are before you set up a legal entity, before you move forward. But so this is really a critical process, or a critical part of the process in succession. And with that, I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Renee and Maria. That was a great presentation and good things to think about. It's hard to do some of this. It's hard to get in situations where it might be uncomfortable for everybody in the room. So we appreciate you giving us some guidance on how to do that. Does anybody have any questions for Maria or Renee?
I have a question.
Sure, go
Go
ahead, Jen.
ahead.
I posted it in the chat with the question in front of it.
Oh, is
Uh,
there,
is there any recourse if one of the family will not participate? Is that the question?
What if the incumbent sees succession as a form of death? They want to hold on to control until the bitter end. They don't want to pass on any control or knowledge or management. Even if they're no longer capable, they undermine others' efforts and prefer the legacy dies with them to losing control.
Yeah, that's tough, but that is there's well, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but there, there's very little that we that you could do because it is in some ways succession does start with the incumbent, with that senior generation wanting that to pass it on, lose control, but and give up control. Um, but yes, that's a lot of times we see that that is a barrier, is that for some folks, they think that succession is a type of death, and so not they will not give up that control. A lot of times we can, if we can say, okay, can we try to have a meeting with them and somebody outside to think about the process in a different way of saying, well, a way succession is a way of extending your legacy and extend and keeping it in the family. And so even if the ownership doesn't pass to the next generation before death, um, the management can, and them learning how to, or your wishes for that legacy can be passed on to try to open up that door a little bit. But it's hard when somebody does not want to cooperate. One of our colleagues who works with us has that problem with her dad. And
Mm.
it can be very hard.
Yeah.
Can the next generation get gathered together and have some sort of plan for once the parent does die?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great option if there's not some kind of plan in place before that incumbent passes the ownership to the next generation. It would be great if we have cooperation amongst family members before that happens, even if the plan is not in place. We have another question too in the chat for forest farm owners who have only owned the property for a few years, and succession might be a bit of a shock for the children. How do you start succession conversations with family in a style that avoids conflict? Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that these succession discussions are often tied, to death, as someone said before, but you can phrase it and start the conversation in a different way, right? You can say, I would love for my children to start helping make management decisions for this property or for this forest or for this business. I really would like to hear your input, and let's talk about what our goals are long term. You can start there. You don't have to say, when I die, what will you do, right? It doesn't have to be always tied to death. You can do things during life. You could bring in that next generation, have them help you make those decisions, help you manage way before their death.
Renee, and I might add, it's also important to help them feel the legacy that you have and to feel in touch with the property. So perhaps it's not about going and doing work on the property. Perhaps it's about bringing them onto it to enjoy it in the way that they want to enjoy it, or enjoy it with multiple generations. Because when they begin to connect to it, they're more likely to want to be a part of the future of it. So sometimes it's not that technical stuff right away, but just developing that relationship with the land itself.
Actually, I think that's really important, Liz. I would say that I always think, when we talk to family businesses, which is the same, it's like, well, you don't want to start, you want to bring your kids in and think about the legacy at the very beginning. You should be thinking of succession when you even start a business, right? So as soon as you own land or start a business, you should be thinking about succession and that, because it should have nothing to do with death. It should have things to be about, like, well, I want this to be in the family. I want us all to enjoy it. I want us all to be able to have this. And it's regardless, because you could die tomorrow, right? Or you could die in 90 years. Well, I guess depending on how old you are. But it should really, as much as possible, if we can like not think about it as in connection to death, right? Because you might have teenagers that you want to have part of it. They're not thinking about death and succession, but think, I want this to always be as part of my family.
We've got another question that asked, what was the question from Linda Voss? Linda, do you want to repeat that question for us? I'm not seeing it in the chat to read it back.
I believe Maria answered that one.
Yeah. Do you remember what that was, Maria?
It was the one about it when somebody wants to not give up management or anything until death.
That's right.
Yes,
Um,
I asked the question and it was the first question and it was answered. And I asked it because I'm in the same situation. So thank you.
okay.
You have my sympathy. You have my sympathy, Linda.
Yeah. We have another question. Does it make sense to leave more ownership to one child over another if that child agrees to be caretaker of the land? Yeah, so I don't have a good, standard answer to this. I'm gonna say it depends. And that's probably not the answer you're looking for. But really, you know your family better than anyone else. If one child is going to be the caretaker, it might make sense, right? We have that fair versus equal debate a lot. um, that might make the most sense for your family if that one person is going to be the caretaker. I would say that if that is the case, take time to explain it to all of your children, why you're making the decisions that you are. That communication aspect is really important. And even if they get mad about the decision, giving them time to process that decision and ask you questions is really, really important.
And I have the harshest answer in some ways because I'm always start off with you owe your kids nothing, and then once you what you give to them because you decide that it's the best thing for what the asset is and who's going to take the best care of the asset. That's kind of the harshest like boom answer, right? It's not, nothing on earth says that anybody needs to inherit anything, right? Once you give your kids the best life that you can and all of these things, after that, things are a gift, right? And thinking about things as if this is a gift and this is something that you want to and you have they share the values of caretaking and things like that, then it makes sense. And there may be other assets that you can give to other children that can make up for that in some ways. But that is a very kind of like harsh answer that I always start. If we start about it that way, then we can kind of build up to where we want to be, right? But yeah, but it is a depends, and you know your kids and you know your family better than anybody else. My kid is 10, so maybe it's easy for me to say that now.
Any other questions for Maria or Renee? Joe commented that he's drinking from a fire hose. I think we all are. It can be a little overwhelming, and I appreciated, Maria, you saying that it does take some time. 6 years sounds a little scary, but I don't think this is anything that you want to plop on somebody's lap and walk away and think that it's, done in an hour or a day or a week. It surely is going to take some thinking over time and everybody getting used to the whole concept. So I appreciate the idea that there is some time involved. Somebody asked about the recording for the last session. We haven't finished editing that. You will get an email when those recordings are available. I think it's going to take me about 2 weeks to get those done. I need to edit and caption them.
Yes, I have a question. How do you put in place an ownership model when the family involved all own it in common and disagree about what needs to be done or if anything needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a really, really tricky situation. That ownership in common can be really awful sometimes, depending on how people's goals are and how we communicate and how we implement those different conflict modes too. Um, I don't know, that's a tricky situation. And depending where you are, if you have that co-ownership or, tenants in common, ownership in common, one of those people can force a sale if you're in Indiana. So if one person decides to sell, then the other, I think you said, were there were a lot of people involved, but it can force a sale of that whole property.
Yeah, there are 4 involved.
Okay, yeah, that can be tricky.
Sounds like the communication issue remains the big elephant in the room, so to speak.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Looks like we've got a couple of questions in the chat too. It says, I have a century farm, no direct heirs, and 13 cousins. I don't see them all at once, so how should I bring up the conversations that I want to pass this on? So thankfully, with today's technology, we have done meetings virtually via Zoom when people are all over the country, even when we have all these different cousins in different places, where some can gather together, at a table somewhere and have the computer up where everybody can try to join. We have seen that happen, to Bruce's question. But yeah, it can be difficult, and you want to make sure that, when you have that many people, it's really important that everybody's getting the same message and it's not really open for interpretation. So I don't know if that's something that you record the Zoom and you share with everybody or what, but Maria, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think it is and you might want to write some things down first and pass it on and say, okay, this is what I want to talk about. Kind of set an agenda for if you don't want to bring up that conversation. Say, I want to talk about this that I have, and so I'd like to gather the family together. And this is kind of like a mini 2-item agenda that I have about it. But think the process through. You said you have 13 cousins. Yeah, that's a lot of people. I always say more people, more problems. So it takes it takes a lot of thinking through, like, what is it, the agenda that you want for whatever meeting you want, and what is it you want to accomplish. So I would think through things a, a little bit first, and even talk to an attorney even before I would set a family meeting to think about what are the possibilities. And then, because you don't want to get people's hopes up, you don't want to, some of those things first. So really take a step back and think, like, what is it that I would want to do, and what do I want to accomplish, and then would call a family meeting if that's what it would require.
Yeah, and Jenna Neese and Veronica Bullock are going to be covering communication and having those meetings and how to do those in an efficient way. So I know that they're going to talk about having an agenda and kind of these rules for meetings that we have. So definitely tune into that session on communication. That will help as well. That'll cover a lot of what Maria said about agendas and making sure that we have a clear message. There's another question. What if the incumbent sees succession as a form of death? They want to hold on to control until the bitter end. They don't want to pass any control or knowledge or management. Even if they're no longer capable, they undermine the efforts and prefer the legacy dies with them to losing control. Yeah, that's a tricky situation. Gotta love family, right?
And that's the one we answered at the very beginning. That's the one that Linda had put up.
Yep.
That people didn't see it in the chat, but
Frank had a question there. Is it common to have formal operating agreement in place?
it depending on depending, I'm not gonna say depend, but depending on the operation, yes, it's pretty common to have operating agreements. We see that a lot in farm operations.
And should that operating agreement include some sort of succession planning? Is that a good way of capturing the intent of a succession plan, or does that make the operating agreement just maybe too complex?
Yeah, so probably the operating agreement combined with a buy-sell agreement. We see those two going in tandem a lot of times. I can post a link in the chat where we have, it's called the farm's legacy, but really it's all about succession. We have farm examples, but the succession, the succession strategies, I would say, can be applied to a number of operations and formations and entities and things like that. We have some good examples of operating agreements in there as well as buy-sell agreements. I would suggest utilizing both of those succession tools, I would call them, if it works well for your family.
Great, thanks.
Where are the operating plans?
Linda, Renee said she'd put it in the chat, but I also will send that out as a reminder document when I send out the other information.
I put the link in chat. That's a free download, and it's about 150 pages, which can seem overwhelming, but you can just search through the document and look for operating agreement or look for buy-sell agreement, and you'll be able to find the parts of the document that I was talking about. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Yes. If you put the property in a trust, does this eliminate some of the problems?
It depends on, I guess, the goals of your family and how that trust was drawn up, and what stipulations it has. I'm not an attorney. Marie and I both aren't attorneys, so I don't really know, without looking at the trust to see if everything's covered. But it's another one of those it depends answers. Unfortunately, in succession, every family, every operation, every property is different. So sometimes trusts can be a good vehicle for succession, and sometimes they're not a good fit. It just depends.
I think that's why it's important to think about what is it that you want the legacy to be, and what do you want that, what do you envision it's going to look like, and then go in and talk to an attorney and say, this is what I envision, this is what I would like it to look like, so that they can give you the appropriate advice on what legal entity would fit best. I think a lot of times we see is if you go to the lawyer and you're not sure, then they might just by reflex put you into an entity that's maybe not what you envision and not the right fit. And then you just have to kind of like switch. But so kind of taking the time to think about what do you really want to happen, then and then getting the attorney to say, okay, yeah, this is the appropriate vehicle for that is the best kind of 1-2 punch.
Any other questions? We're after the 8 o'clock hour. We're welcome to go a few minutes longer if anyone would like, but if not, we can wrap and let you go on with your evening.
I just wanted to say that person asking it about a trust, our property is in trust and I've gotten left in the unenviable position of trustee. And I would just caution you to be careful because my understanding of my role is that I have to do the highest fiduciary thing. And so if there's one person in the group who wants to sell it, that's gonna be it because it's gonna be worth a lot more as a piece of real estate now than as a woods. So, yeah, I don't think trust protects it the way perhaps the person who wrote the trust thought it was going to. And putting the person who maybe cares about it the most as trustee also, I don't think protects it because I feel like my opinion about it is the most devalued because I have this duty now as trustee. So I don't know if I'm misunderstanding, but what I'm gathering from you all is that I should try to do a lot of persuasive communicating ahead of time.
Yeah. Good
That was
luck.
part of my question with regard to an operating agreement. We are currently working on something like that we're hoping to capture the long-term intent of the operation so that it's clearly communicated to whether it be a trustee or somebody else who then ultimately has to execute that plan. I don't know if that's ultimately going to work, but that's part of the reason why I wanted to attend these, to see what, direction we should be taking.
Yeah, I would make sure you have that buy-sell agreement in place with that operating agreement, because in that buy-sell agreement, you can set terms of a sale, and try to help with that property, the price per acre or whatever you put into effect there. The operating agreement with the buy-sell can go really, really well hand in hand.
Yeah, and in that regard, I spoke to somebody, and they typically, discount people who want to remain as shareholders. They discount it, and somebody suggested that they discount it by as much as 40%. Does anybody have experience like that? Does that sound unreasonable?
No, I mean, there's a lot of family discounts that are, yeah, that can happen.
That is what my mother set up, and it has saved our farm to have the discount and the buy-sell agreement. And that's what I recommend to the person who is the trustee. Maybe you can get something like that in place.
Yeah. Yeah, we've seen very large discounts, and sometimes when the people in the family that want to sell, when they see that discount, it kind of dissuades them from wanting to sell. They don't get as much out of it. So it kind of it serves more than one purpose in a lot of ways. Somebody had another question. Don't all parties have to agree to sell? I don't know about other states. Indiana, if you have that common ownership, one person can force a sale, unfortunately.
But how does that work? That doesn't make sense at all. If I have 6 brothers or 6 siblings, so I could come in and say, guys, we're selling, sorry.
Yeah, basically. And then, I mean, the other 6 could have, that's why we want those buy-sell agreements, because it basically, you can have it in place where the other 6 have the first right of refusal to buy that. That's where that comes into place, and you can help set those values. But yeah,
Okay.
in Indiana, at least, one person wanting to sell. Okay, so somebody we have an LLC and our discount is 50%. Yeah. So if you can get that agreement in place and signed where it's actually in effect, you can put those different tools in place. Yeah. It does seem weird though if you have 7 or 8 owners, one person can force that. It's called a divide, and it's long and legally costly. Okay.
But then the operating agreement with those defined terms would, I don't know, override that, but would provide the framework for how that sale would go, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
You would at least know what terms to expect if you have a sibling or, a cousin or somebody that you own with, and that's going to happen, or if you know that next generation that's going to be an issue. It's a really good tool to put in place.
On the forced sale, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going through that right now, Liz. And the thing about it is, one person can file a lawsuit, and then the property is then appraised, and then you have to agree on the appraiser. If you don't agree on the appraiser, the judge will appoint an appraiser. And then after this is all done, the judge will appoint a mediator. And you have 90 days from the date that he appoints a mediator to settle. If it's not settled, it goes to the sheriff's sale.
Yeah, not fun. That's
Nope.
something we want to avoid.
Well, I think we might go ahead and wrap this for tonight. I really appreciate Renee and Maria being with us tonight and sharing their expertise. Good information that we can all use, and I want to thank them for their time tonight. We'll be seeing you all again next Monday night at 7 p.m., same time, to talk about family communication and family meetings. So have a good evening, and we thank you for coming.